Welcome back. In this video, we're going to be talking about G.K. Chesterton's essay, Introductory Remarks on the Importance of Orthodoxy. So let's get right to it. So who was G.K. Chesterton? So his name stands for, the G.K. stands for Gilbert Keith Chesterton. He was born in 1874 and he lived until 1936. He was a famed journalist, novelist, and essayist. He strongly influenced authors like T.S. Eliot, you may have heard of, or C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis, recognize the name, we're going to come across him later in the semester. He's, of course, famous, among other things, for writing the Chronicles of Narnia. G.K. Chesterton also had a massive influence on J.R.R. Tolkien. You may know who that is as well. He's the guy who wrote The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings series. At one point, G.K. Chesterton was being considered for canonization as a saint by the Roman Catholic Church. So extremely influential thinker amongst Roman Catholics. Although he himself was actually a convert. He was not born into the Roman Catholic Church. So a couple other things about him. I mean, I love G.K. Chesterton. He is an interesting character. First of all, like physically, he was like a giant. You can like look up pictures of him. So this is, again, late 1800s, early 1900s. He was like 6'2", 320 pounds. He was like the size of like an offensive lineman. And this is back in like the Victorian era where they just like did not make them that big very often. But he's an interesting guy. He was kind of like really, obviously incredibly intelligent, but he was just like absent-minded, kind of like a goofball of a person. If you read his essays, like he had a column, I don't know if it was daily, but he had a column in a paper in England, and some of the stuff that he would write would just be absolutely hilarious, just absolutely ridiculous. So lots of stories about him just like being generally a goofball, because that's just like what he was. He's the kind of guy that, you know, as I say, big, huge guy, but you can imagine him just like, you know, his hat blows into the street, and, you know, and he just like, you know, runs in after it without, you know, paying attention to cars and like swerving around him, or just like, you know, just lost in thought and kind of like walk out into the street and cars have to swerve around him. He's that kind of person. There's a story about him once that he was at the train station. He didn't know where he was supposed to be. So I was about to say he texted his wife, but this was like in the early 1990s. He did not text. Carrier pigeon. No, he telegraphed his wife. He was like, I am at the train station. Where am I supposed to be? And she telegraphed him back, home. Like, time for you to come home now, man. That's where you're supposed to be. So he's just like an interesting character all around. So I like him because I think his personality. I like his personality. He's kind of a goofball. But also, I just like reading him. He's hilarious. He's a master of language. And if you've read the essay, hopefully you will. If you've read the essay, you will see he just loves playing with language. And so he will say lots of paradoxical or apparently contradictory things. Like he will say things like, in this essay, he says, everything matters except everything. You're like, wait, that doesn't make any sense. But if you think about it in the context of what he's saying, like, oh, it does make sense. He's saying, like, every little thing matters to us. Like, we care about little stuff, you know, like what the Phillies are doing, what the weather is like, but we don't care about big stuff, like the meaning of life, or like, you know, does God exist? Like, those kinds of questions tend to be taboo in our culture, and we tend to like to focus on the little things, like, you know, what's your favorite band? So every little thing matters, but everything, you know, religion, philosophy, the big questions of life, that doesn't matter to us, right? So everything matters except everything. So if you understand what he's saying, it's like, wow, that's brilliant. The way he puts that is just is fascinating and interesting. So I read him because I enjoy reading him primarily, but also because I disagree with him about a lot. So I've read a ton of his stuff, and I find myself in disagreement with him frequently. But he will say things, and I'll just be like, oh, that's just like obviously wrong. That's just like clearly wrong. And then I'll read what he has to say about it, and I'm like, yeah, that's not so stupid. I thought he was like clearly wrong, and now I'm not so sure. So one of the things I like reading about him is he always challenges me, but he does it like in a humorous way, and he always makes me see things from a new perspective, which is one of the things I like about him. Like one of the things, I won't even get into details about this, but if you're curious, I don't know, shoot me an email. I can point you to the essay. But he wrote an essay about why divorce is not a thing. Like he's not saying it's you shouldn't do it, although I think he thinks that you shouldn't do it too. But he thinks it's like not a real thing. It's like made up. It's like he says it's a superstition. So I think the essay that it's from is called The Superstition of Divorce. And I was like, yeah, Chesterton, you're like totally off the rails on this one. But again, what he says is not stupid. Like I still disagree with him, but it's like what he says is not stupid. So he's like, you know, traditional Roman Catholic, doesn't think that society should allow divorces. And it's like, yeah, that must be wrong. But then you hear what he has to say, and it's like, your boy is not stupid. So and he's just thinking about this from a very, very different perspective. So I disagree with him, but it's mind expanding to read him. Plus, as I say, he does it in such a fun, entertaining kind of way that I just love reading him. So some things, if you're interested in reading some stuff by him, you can read his book called Man Alive, which is just absolutely fascinating. It's a novel. So if you're into novels, you're into literature, I highly recommend Man Alive. Another great one is The Man Who Was Thursday. I mean, come on, that's like the greatest title ever, The Man Who Was Thursday. Both of those are novels. And again, I would avoid reading anything about these books before you read them, because anything you read about them will just be spoilers. Like I read about The Man Who Was Thursday before I read it, and it definitely was not as cool as it would have been if I had just read it by going into it blind. So highly recommend his stuff. I'm sure that you'll come across tons of stuff, and if you read many of his works, his essays, his books, you'll find lots of stuff to disagree with, but you'll also probably find yourself laughing and just enjoying yourself a great deal. So highly recommend his stuff. Also, last thing about him before we talk about the essay in particular is I want to stress that Chesterton, because he sometimes comes across, I think, to students as abrasive or inflammatory. I think some of it's intentional. But I want to say he's not like a total arrogant ass. Like when I teach this in an in-person class, I always ask the students as a discussion question: is it arrogant to think that you're right about things? Is it arrogant to think that you're right? Again, great topic for a reflection assignment. Chesterton obviously thinks that he's right about things. and this is what we're going to be talking about today. He clearly thinks that he's right, but he also recognizes that he could be wrong, and that's what this essay is about. Is he is soliciting feedback from other people. But the way he does it is he does it in a very Chestertonian style. He's not just like, oh, excuse me, good sir, what do you think about topic X? Now he's like, much more bombastic and grandiose. He's like, here's what I think. I'm right about everything. That's what he wants to say. You're wrong about everything. I'm right. In fact, this essay is the introductory essay from a book called Heretics. If you know anything about the word heretic, if you call somebody a heretic, you're saying that they're wrong. You're saying that they're like horribly wrong. And this book is, this essay is from a book, a collection of essays actually, called Heretics, and it's all the essays are about his peers. So each of the essays is like titled after one of his contemporaries, people that in some cases people that he knew. So there's like an essay entitled George Bernard Shaw, and it's about why George Bernard Shaw is wrong about everything. Who's like another very famous author. H.G. Wells, another very famous author, is an essay. Just again, the title of the essay is just H.G. Wells, or might have that one actually might have a longer title. I can't remember, but the names of the authors appear in a lot of these titles. And it's just an essay devoted to why these individual thinkers are wrong about everything. So again, you might think that he's being like, wow, like what an asshole. But he does kind of have a bombastic style to him. But he's a goofball. That's what you have to remember about him. He's not being an asshole. He is poking and prodding these people. A lot of them, as I say, he knew and had personal relationships with. Like George Bernard Shaw was like one of his close friends, and they could not be further apart in terms of their beliefs. I mean, Shaw is like an atheist. Chesterton's a convinced Catholic. But they obviously have tremendous amount of affection for one another. So when Chesterton writes an essay entitled George Bernard Shaw, like why George Bernard Shaw is wrong about everything, Shaw is not going to be like, oh my gosh, what a terrible person. He's just like, oh, Chesterton, like you asked. Right. So what Chesterton is doing is he's saying all these people are wrong about everything. And in fact, he did publish this book, and a number of people responded to him, and they're like, okay, Chesterton, we're all wrong about everything, so please, good sir, enlighten us. What is the truth? Since you know, apparently. And Chesterton, he wrote a book in response called Orthodoxy, and it's basically the truth according to G.K. Chesterton, which is actually a defense of Roman Catholic doctrine, because that's what he believes, is he believes in Roman Catholicism. And so he writes this book, and he says in the preface to that book, Orthodoxy, he says, people should never challenge somebody like me to write a book, because I will write a book at the drop of a hat, basically. So they challenged him, saying, what is the truth? And he's like, I'll tell you what the truth is, basically. But again, he's not being an arrogant ass. He obviously thinks that he's right. But the reason why he's poking these other people is he's like, I think that I'm right. I really think that I'm right. Like I'm convinced that I'm right. But you obviously think that I'm wrong because I read your stuff and we disagree. So here's why I think that you're wrong. He's like, come fight with me. Come challenge me. Right? He's almost this kind of person. He's like, goes out. If you imagine like two armies and there's like a river between them and a bridge. Chesterton is the kind of person who wants to come out from his side and be the champion of his side. Right? He'll come out to the bridge and he'll be like, bring me your greatest warrior and I will meet him in glorious battle. This is like what he wants to do. And so that's what he's kind of doing. He's poking these people who who he likes but who disagree with him. And he's like, come play. Tell me why you think that I'm wrong. And so they do. They'll say, Chesterton, like, your writing is brilliant, but like you're wrong about this, and this. And Chesterton he thinks that he's right, but he recognizes that he might be wrong, which is why he's soliciting this kind of feedback from other people. Because he's like, this seems so, it seems what I believe seems so true to me, but I might be wrong and I can't see it. I need somebody else to show me where I might be wrong. And that's what he's doing, is he's bringing other people, challenging other people, and a kind of like, as I say, bombastic kind of gentle giant wanting to tussle with these other people. He does it in that kind of way, but he wants them to push back because he knows that they're going to be most likely to be able to see where he's made a mistake if he's made a mistake. So let's turn to the essay itself. All right, so let's do it. Let's talk about this essay. So again, the title of the essay is Introductory Remarks on the Importance of Orthodoxy. So we're going to do a short version of this. I'm going to break the essay essentially into 4 parts. First, we're going to talk about what it means, what the word orthodox means, and then I'm going to say that Chesterton is making essentially 3 points in this essay. All right. So let's start with the word orthodox. So the title of the essay, Introductory Remarks on the Importance of Orthodoxy. So it's really important that you understand what the word orthodox means, what orthodoxy means. So if you look up orthodox in the dictionary, pretty much what you'll see orthodox means something like traditional or everyday or average or mainstream. You might have the sense that it has a kind of conservative connotation, which is definitely true, right? So you might think, for example, of Orthodox Jewish people, right? Orthodox Judaism, they tend to be on the more conservative end of things as opposed to Reform Judaism. Similarly, in the Christian tradition, you have Orthodox Christians who tend to be more conservative than progressive style Christians. That's a kind of like everyday definition that you'll find. That's how people use the term kind of in everyday speech. Orthodox means something like traditional, yeah, average, mainstream, something like that. But that's not how Chesterton is specifically using the word. In fact, he toys with the fact and plays with the fact, because he loves language, that orthodox actually has 2 different meanings. So let's talk about what the word literally means. So we talked about kind of like the dictionary definition, but the dictionary definition is not the etymological definition. We've talked a little bit about etymology in the previous video. Remember that etymology studies the historical and linguistic roots of words. One of the things that Chesterton is doing is he is toying with the fact that the dictionary definition of the word orthodox and the etymological definition of orthodox are different from one another. So dictionary definition, mainstream, traditional, that's what orthodox means. But Chesterton is obviously has in mind the fact that the word orthodox etymologically means right belief, as in correct belief, right? So orthos, right or correct, doxis, belief or opinion. So you put those together, it's Greek again, it's Greek everywhere, right? You get right belief. So you have to understand what the word means in order to even understand the title of the essay. The title of the essay is Introductory Remarks on the Importance of Orthodoxy. You can now translate that essentially as Introductory Remarks on the Importance of Having Right Beliefs. So one of the things that Chesterton is doing in this essay is he's lamenting the fact that people don't really care about being orthodox anymore. And he's writing this essay, I believe it's in 1905. but I think it's just as true today. That's one of the weird things about this essay is if you like sub in newer examples, and this essay could have been written like yesterday, which is one of the things that I find fascinating and interesting about it. It's one of the things that's true of great literature is it's perennially relevant. So he is lamenting the fact that people don't care about being orthodox anymore. They don't care about being right. What they care about is being unique. What they care about is being unusual. Think of like social media influencers today. They want to be like outside the box. They want to be interesting. They want to be different, right? And this is what Chesterton is saying is true at the time too. People wanted to be unorthodox in the dictionary sense, right? They wanted to be not average, not traditional, not mainstream. They wanted to be different. They wanted to be unique. They wanted to stand out. That's what people cared about, right? So Chesterton is lamenting the fact that they don't care about being orthodox anymore, and he's toying with the word here, right? He is saying that they no longer care about being right. Etymological definition. What they care about is being unorthodox, and the kind of like they want to be unusual. They want to be different. They want to stand out, right? So he is saying that, like, imagine this. Imagine you're like hanging out at a party, and people are like sitting around, whatever, drinking their, I don't know what people drink in England, Guinness or port. I don't know what they drink over there. Anyway, so people are sitting around and they're like, drinking their wine or whatever, and somebody's like at a party, it's like, well, I suppose my beliefs about politics are somewhat unorthodox. And people are like, oh my goodness, this person is so interesting. What are you? Are you a socialist? Are you a communist? Are you an anarchist? They're so interesting, right? What Chesterton is saying is like, pay attention to what you're saying when you're saying that your beliefs are unorthodox. Like, what are you literally saying if you're saying that your beliefs are unorthodox? You're literally saying, in an etymological sense, you're literally saying that your beliefs are false, right? If the word orthodox literally etymologically means right belief, if you're saying that your beliefs are unorthodox, you're saying that they're false. they're wrong beliefs. You're like, yeah, I suppose my beliefs about politics are somewhat wrong. It's like, no, that's not interesting, right? And this is what Chesterton is saying, is people care so much more about being unusual, about you being unique, about standing out, about being different, about being interesting, than they care about being right. And he says, that's stupid, basically is what he's saying. That is a bad goal to have, is just to try to be different or unusual or to stand out. He thinks what everybody should try to be, what everybody should want to be, is orthodox, is to be right. And in fact, he thinks deep down this is what everybody actually thinks. Even the people who claim themselves as being unorthodox and so interesting, they're really just trying to be orthodox, right? Because if you're like, unless you're just like a total asshole and just believing things just for the the thrill. Other than that, people who are like actually committed Marxists, they don't think that they're unorthodox. This is kind of Chesterton's point. They think that they're right. They think that liberals and socialists and other people are wrong and progressives are wrong. They're like, no, the Marxism, that's the right way to be, right? Even he thinks actual heretics, even people who have left the Roman Catholic faith, and he might consider a theological heretic. A theological heretic, this is what he says at the beginning, is he says heretics don't think that they're heretics. They think that they're orthodox. They think that everybody else is a heretic. And this is kind of Chesterton's point. He's like, I think all of these, with this book, in this introductory essay, he's basically saying, I think that all of these people are heretics, but they don't, right? They all think that they're right. So let's talk about it and let's see who is right. So getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. So let's now talk about the 3 points that Chesterton wants to make in this essay. All right, point number 1 that Chesterton wants to make in this essay. Again, he does not make this kind of enumeration in the essay itself. You should definitely read it, because I'm definitely skipping over some of the things, condensing. There's a lot more in this essay that we could talk about that I find interesting and fascinating, and also just funny. If you did read it, I think it's hilarious. In any case, the first point that he wants to make in this essay is that everybody thinks that they're orthodox. You actually have to write it 4 times, like on a quiz or a midterm. Yeah, no, everybody thinks that they're orthodox. Everybody thinks that they are right. So in philosophy, this is just straightforwardly true, because the way that what the word belief means is just to think that you're right about something. So everybody thinks that they're right. Everybody believes that they're right. Everybody thinks that they are orthodox. This is because in philosophy, just to have a belief, to have an opinion, what that means is just to think that something is true, right? So if you think that I believe that it's sunny out right now, that just means that I think that it's true that it's sunny outside right now. If I think that it's raining outside, right? If I have that belief, if I have that opinion, that would just be to think that it's true, that it's raining outside, right? So if you think anything, if you have any opinion, if you have any belief, then you think that you're right about that. So in a very straightforward way, everybody does literally think that they are orthodox, because that's just what it means to have a belief. To have a belief is just to think that you're correct about something, right? To think that you're right about something. This is why I always think it's bizarre when people complain. They'll complain about oh, that Janine, she thinks that she is right about everything. I'm always like, like, don't you? I do. Like, I think I'm right about everything that I think. That's why I think it. If I thought I was wrong, I would change my mind, and then I would think I was right about that. Like, there's no way out of this. If you can't, you can't have a belief and then think you're wrong about that. That's like a contradiction in terms. Because if you were to have a belief and think that you're wrong about it, that just means that you don't think that it's true, which means that you don't have that belief in the first place. You follow that? I hope that made sense. In any case, to have a belief is just to think that you're right. And Chesterton thinks this is true about everybody, right? So he gives the example in the text of the anarchist dynamiter, right? So if you're not familiar with what anarchists are, here you go. Talk a little bit about anarchy. Anarchists are people who believe that governments are bad, right? So they wanted to overthrow the government. You can have anarchists on the far left and also on the far right, which is interesting. But they are people who think that governments are bad and should be overthrown and gotten done away with. And so there are actually people like this. Well, there's still people like this, but there were people in England at the time who were literally blowing up buildings and stuff like this, essentially domestic terrorists, what we call domestic terrorists nowadays, trying to destabilize the government. So if you are familiar with oh my gosh, what's his name? The detective? Oh my gosh, Sherlock Holmes, right? The recent, well, I was going to say recent. To you, these are probably old. The movies made with Robert Downey Jr. and Jude Law, the Sherlock Holmes movies. I think it's the second one where one of the people that they're trying to catch is dynamiting buildings and blowing stuff up. And this was actually happening, I believe, at the time. And so people were going around trying to destabilize the government. And Chesterton says of anarchist dynamiters, people who are like essentially domestic terrorists, he says they think that they're orthodox. Like they think what they're doing is correct. He's like, I don't, right? Clearly, he's like, I don't think that what they're doing is right. I think what they're doing is wrong. I think that these are essentially something like heretics. I think that these people have bad ideas. These people have false ideas, but they don't think that. And he's like, and that's why they're intelligible to me. He's like, I think that they're wrong, but it would be something entire. It's one thing for somebody to do something that you disagree with if they think that it's right, but it's something else entirely if somebody's like, I'm going to do this thing that I regard as bad, and I'm just going to like do it anyway. Like that's like a totally different kind of level. We'll actually talk a little bit about that later in the semester. If anybody ever does that, that's intentionally, knowingly chooses to do something that they believe to be bad. We're going to talk about whether or not anybody ever does that. It's an interesting. That's actually what your paper will be about later in the semester. So it's an interesting topic. But Chesterton thinks, people in terms of their beliefs, they do not. Everybody thinks that they're orthodox, right? So if a person is an anarchist, that's because they believe that anarchy is the right way to go, right? He would say the same thing if he had been around, a couple years ago about ISIS. He would have said, people who are in ISIS. And I'd be curious if you agree with this. But do people in ISIS think that ISIS is wrong? Like, do they think that what they're doing is wrong? You may have heard the phrase that like one man's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter, like that kind of thing. I think that ISIS thought of themselves not as freedom fighters per se, but they were trying to build an Islamic state, and they thought that they were right in doing so. I think that Chesterton is correct about this. But interestingly, Chesterton is not a relativist. We're going to talk about why. He recognizes that people have different beliefs about stuff, but he's like, so what? People are wrong. Happens all the time. And so he would say these anarchists and ISIS are wrong, but nevertheless, they think that they're correct because everybody thinks that they're orthodox. All right, so that's point number one. Okay, so point number two that Chesterton wants to make in this essay is that just because you think that you're orthodox, just because you think that you're right, doesn't mean that you're right. Right? So just because you think you're orthodox doesn't mean that you're orthodox. Just because you think you're right doesn't mean that you're right. You can put it either way, provided that you understand what the word orthodox means. Right? So everybody thinks that they're right, but just because you think you're right doesn't mean that you are right. Again, Chesterton is no relativist. He thinks that everybody thinks that they're right, but some people are correct in thinking that they're right, and some people are wrong in thinking that they're right. This is just part of what it is to be a human being. He thinks people make mistakes, and so sometimes people think they're right when they're not actually right. So this is ties into one of the kind of like themes of this course, the way that philosophy works, is philosophers recognize that everybody thinks that they're right, but they also recognize that just because you think you're right doesn't mean that you're actually right. And this is why it's so important that people be able to talk, express themselves freely to one another so we can challenge one another. This is what Chesterton is in fact doing, is he is challenging other people and expecting them to respond to him. And that's what he wants, because he thinks that he's right, but he recognizes that he could be wrong. He obviously believes that he's correct, otherwise he would hold different beliefs. And so everybody thinks that they're right, but because everybody thinks they're right, but they could also be wrong, it's important for us to engage with one another in order to figure out who is actually right. And so one of the things that Chesterton is lamenting in the fact that people don't care about being orthodox anymore is they just don't really want to talk about important ideas. And he thinks that this sucks, right? Again, this is written in 1905, but this could have been written in like 2020. This could have been written last week. So he says, throughout history, human beings, especially philosophers, have struggled, fought, and in some cases actually died in order to be able to express themselves freely, because that has not been the norm in human society for people to just be able to express their ideas freely. So you may or may not know, we're going to talk more about this later in the semester, but the person who is considered to be the first real true philosopher in the Western tradition, Socrates, was executed by his city-state, by the Athenians, for practicing philosophy. He was charged with corrupting the youth and impiety. And so he was found guilty, and he was sentenced to death. And so he was forced to drink hemlock, and he died because he basically says during his trial, he's like, you can execute me if you want, but I'm just gonna go down to the underworld and do philosophy down there. So it doesn't really matter too much to me, because in fact, before they sentenced him to death, they just wanted him out of their hair. Like he just irritated them basically, because he goes around questioning people and showing people that they're wrong about things, and people don't like it when you do that, especially when you're like very famous or powerful, and then somebody in the street is like showing you up basically. That's what Socrates would do. There's debates about whether or not he was kind of an asshole. I think not. I think he was actually trying to figure out what the truth is, and then he would go talk to people, and he's like, oh, you know what the truth is, and this person would be like, yes, don't mean to brag, but yeah, I know a little bit about justice or whatever it is. And then Socrates would talk to them and find out that they didn't know very much about justice. But he would do this publicly, right? In the marketplace, that's where people would talk. And so everybody would witness this, and people didn't like it, and so they didn't like him doing philosophy. So they would have been happy to just get him out of their hair, like go to Sparta, go bother somebody else, dude. But Socrates wouldn't have it. He's like, no, I'm going to do philosophy whether I'm alive or whether I'm dead, right? Because I will just go into the underworld and just start questioning people down there about these very same things. So he's like, if you want me out of your hair, you're gonna have to kill me, basically. And so they did. That is what happens. But people couldn't talk freely about their ideas in ancient Greece, right? People are like, oh, don't talk about that. If you start talking about justice and love and equality and stuff like that, we're gonna put you to death. And Socrates is like, F you, pal. Like, I'm gonna talk about it anyway. And so they put him to death. But again, this is perennial. This is like throughout human history. In the Middle Ages, do you think that people could talk freely about their beliefs? Like, no. Although this is a worthwhile time to make the point that you may have heard about the Roman Catholic Church burning scientists at the stake in the Middle Ages. That is a myth. That did not happen. First of all, because there were no scientists in the Middle Ages from the previous video. There were only natural philosophers. But even then, the Roman Catholic Church did not put people to death for doing natural philosophy per se. They did put people to death. Chesterton mentions in the essay that, in the heyday, he doesn't use that word, but in the heyday of the Middle Ages, people would sometimes be put to death by the Inquisition or would be burned. Right? He says, we burned philosophers at the stake in the city square for having wrong beliefs. So they did burn philosophers. They did not burn scientists or natural philosophers for their scientific beliefs or their natural philosophical beliefs. Your beliefs about the cosmos by itself would not have gotten you in trouble with the Roman Catholic Church. I'm a Protestant. I'm not a fan of the Roman Catholic Church per se. Right? Don't tell my bosses because I'm a Protestant. But that's just historically true. No scientist was burned at the stake for their scientific beliefs during the Middle Ages. Just never happened. There weren't that many of them. We know how they died. So in any case, people were burned at the stake for their theological beliefs. You could not just hold whatever beliefs that you wanted in the Middle Ages in Europe. You could not. Well, maybe if you kept them to yourself, you could get away with it. You couldn't do it publicly. And if you tried to talk about it publicly, they would be like, shut up, or we're going to like burn you at the stake. And again, some philosophers were like, F you, I'm going to do it anyway, right? And so they would get burned at the stake. Again, moving the clock forward, think about the period of the revolutionary period in places like France and in America. Could you talk freely about your political beliefs? Like, hell no, right? I mean, the founding fathers, and they were like getting together and doing their thing, fomenting a revolution. I mean, that's like treason. That's like something you get a lot of trouble for. They would have to like, meet in pubs or whatever, like looking over their shoulders, less like a loyalist, rat them out. Because if they got caught, they would have, the King of England was essentially chasing them around the countryside. not like literally, come back, are you meddling kids? Because they're chasing them around. But he had been trying to catch them. If he had caught them, they would have hung them all, right? So Benjamin Franklin, good with words, said of the founding fathers, he says, we must all hang together, or most assuredly, we shall all hang separately, right? So he's good with words. But that was true, because you couldn't talk freely about, liberty and the fraternity of all humankind and this kind of stuff if it meant revolution. And that's what people were talking about. They were talking about revolution. They were talking about freedom. They were talking about overthrowing the king. And if you try to talk about stuff like that, you're going to get into trouble, right? So you can't talk freely about ideas. And then what Chesterton says in this essay, which is brilliant, is he says the old liberals, liberal meaning freedom lover, right? He says the old liberals, he's like, philosophers and people and activists, wouldn't have called them that back then, but these liberals, he says, would push for various freedoms because they're freedom lovers. So freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, all these kinds of things. Think of like the Bill of Rights. This is what the liberals were pushing for. Is they were pushing for individual freedoms of these kinds. And he's like, Chesterton, no liberal himself, is like, to the liberals, he's like, kudos. And he's being deadly serious about this. Good work. He's like, you liberals cared about freedom of speech because you really cared about the truth and you wanted people to be able to speak freely so that we could figure out what the truth is. And like, you know what? You won. And because of that, we won. You liberals won. And because of that, we've all won. So now we can talk freely about whatever we want to talk about. We can do that. And he's like, and now that we have this freedom, 2,500 years, and people were like, if you speak your mind, we're going to kill you. We'll burn you at the stake. And some philosophers were like, F you, we're going to do it anyway. And nowadays we're like, we can talk freely about whatever we want. If you want to like talk about abortion, you can talk about abortion rights. If you want to talk about whatever, like there being no God, you can talk about there being no God. If you want to talk about these kinds of things, you can talk about it. So what do we talk about? The Phillies? The weather? Music? Like that's all that we talk about. This is what Chesterton says. This is why he says everything matters except everything. He says now that we have won the freedom to talk about whatever it is that we want to talk about, he's like all that people will talk about is like Miley Cyrus and whatever. This guy, well, he doesn't say Miley Cyrus. That would be interesting if he pulled that off. His example is he says now that we have the freedom to talk about everything, all that we talk about is tram cars and Botticelli. Like is what he says. That's why you just have to update the examples, right? That's music and transportation. That's like people want to talk about electric cars or something. It's like okay, you can talk about that, but if you want to start talking about abortion or something, people are like no. Not publicly. Don't do that, right? I'm curious if you think that this is right. I do think it's true in some sense, right? People don't want to talk about important ideas. You go to your girlfriend's house, meet the parents for the first time. You're like, so, Mr. Smith, what are your beliefs about abortion? People don't want to talk about stuff like that, right? And so Chesterton says, again, this is in 1905. Chesterton says, good taste has silenced us where everything else has failed, right? People are like, you want to talk about philosophy? We're going to make you drink hemlock. You want to talk about theology? We're going to effing burn you at the stake. You want to talk about politics? We'll hang you. And people are like, F you, we're going to do it anyway. And nowadays people are like, oh, don't talk about that. You might upset somebody. And you're like, oh. I don't want to do that. Okay, I'll be quiet. What's up with that? This is what Chesterton is saying. Again, this is in 1905. He's talking about cancel culture, I guess, to use a modern reference. But he's saying we don't talk about important things because we're so worried that, it's going to upset somebody. So we all just keep our damn mouth shut. And he's like, that's the whole point. That was the whole point of 2,500 years of struggle. So we could talk freely, so that we could discuss important ideas like ethics and philosophy and religion. And now that type of stuff is just seen as impolite, is not fit for a polite conversation. You might upset somebody. You might ruffle some feathers if you're like a Roman Catholic and you think that atheists are mistaken or the Buddhists are mistaken. You might upset somebody, right? If you believe in abortion rights and somebody else is pro-life, you might upset them. So like let's not talk about this, right? Let's not talk about race. Let's not talk about gender. Let's not talk about these kinds of things. And Chesterton's like, that sucks, right? We need to be able to talk about these kinds of things because everybody has beliefs about this stuff anyway, and everybody thinks that they're right, but they could be wrong. And so he thinks it's extraordinarily important that we be able to speak our minds about these kinds of things, not so we can just mouth off and just like express ourselves. That's not Chesterton. Some people might think that, but that's not Chesterton. Chesterton thinks we need to be able to talk about these kinds of things because we could be wrong, right? My beliefs about race or gender or sexuality or abortion or God or whatever, all of these things could be wrong. And because of that, and because I base my life on these beliefs, right? If you're a Christian, that affects the way that you live. That affects not just how you think about things, but it affects the way that you live. Right? And if you're wrong about that, you want to know. Chesterton's like, I want to know. I'm a Roman Catholic. I'm convinced. I'm pretty sure that this is right. But I might be wrong. George Bernard Shaw, my boy, he's an atheist. He's no dope. And he thinks that I'm full of crap. And so I want to know why he thinks that I'm full of crap. Because if I am, I want to know. Right? Because that means that I'm living my life in the wrong kind of way. And so that's why he thinks it's important to be able to talk about these kinds of things. So first, everybody thinks that they're Orthodox. Secondly, just because you think you're Orthodox doesn't mean that you're Orthodox. All right. And on to the final point. Point number 3. So first we have everybody thinks that they're Orthodox. Second we have just because you think you're Orthodox doesn't mean that you're Orthodox. Third, Chesterton wants to say it matters a whole hell of a lot if your beliefs are actually Orthodox. You have to have the swear word in there. Otherwise I'll mark you down. No, I'm just kidding. You can edit out the swear word. It matters a whole lot if your beliefs are actually Orthodox. All right, why? So I'm going to make a bit of an argument here. I'm a philosopher. This is how we roll. So I'm going to make a bit of an argument, but I'm going to give you a kind of tagline, which I hope you can kind of commit to memory, and that'll help you remember on a quiz, midterm, final, or just in life in general. Because I think that Chesterton is right about this. You're welcome to think that I'm wrong. You got to make an argument, right? It's not just about expressing your opinions here in philosophy. That's not just what it is. It's not just about venting your opinions. It's about figuring out what is true so that we can live well, right? So if you think that I'm wrong, awesome. Make an argument. Seriously, like contact me, send me an email, whatever. Set up a WebEx and we can chat about it. But here's the tagline, and then I'll make the argument. So here's the argument in a nutshell. That's what the tagline is. Acting on false beliefs can cause harm. Acting on false beliefs can cause harm, both to yourself and to other people, right? So why does it matter if your beliefs are actually orthodox, right? Everybody thinks that their beliefs are right. Why does it matter if they're actually right? Because acting on false beliefs can cause harm. That's why it matters, all right? So I'm going to give you an argument actually by kind of illustration here. So this illustration, the primary illustration comes from World War II. I'm a person who's really interested in World War II. And so this is actually depicted in the HBO series Band of Brothers. If you have not seen that series, you should watch it. It's now, I guess, maybe like 20 years old or something like that, but it is also one of the highest ranked TV shows on IMDb.com. I think it's ranked like second or something like that, or third. It's like 9.4 on IMDb.com. And so Band of Brothers, this HBO series, they interviewed a group of soldiers from World War II who are paratroopers, and then they depict their experiences. So the action sequences are broken up by interviews with the actual participants, who are obviously elderly at the time that they were doing these interviews, but then they depict their experiences. And what I'm about to describe to you is something that they actually experienced. And so it's depicted in one of the episodes. I think that the episode is entitled Why We Fight. I highly recommend it. It's like 10 hours long, the whole series. I think oftentimes it's on, on the History Channel or whatever, like over Memorial Day weekend. I think they probably still do show it then. Check it out. Okay, so during World War II, my understanding is that the higher ups knew about the existence of concentration camps far earlier than other people did, intelligence, high command, this kind of stuff. The GIs on the ground, though, they were not like getting text message updates about concentration camps, every morning. Dwight Eisenhower's not like, texting them updates, have fun out there today, guys, smiley face. Like their day-to-day life, sucked, the soldiers in the front. So we're thinking like, I'm talking here like 1944, 1945, well, their lives sucked through the whole war. But you can see what their day-to-day life was like a lot of times in that HBO series, and it is awful, like awful. But their day-to-day life is basically like, go over there. If there are, Nazis there, like shoot them, kill them, and then like dig in and hold a line. So their day-to-day life is not like these, big meta questions, what's going on in the general strategy of the war. They're, they're a cog in the, big machine kind of thing. So they're not, getting these intelligence briefs. So I don't think that my understanding is that the GIs on the ground did not know about the existence of concentration camps. Although, as is depicted in Band of Brothers, they encountered one. These GIs are, walking through the woods or whatever one day. They're like on patrol, and so they are going through the woods. And they come into a clearing, and they see inside this like barbed wire fence within barbed wire fence, and these like living, walking human skeletons essentially inside. And these are like battle-hardened soldiers who had seen like a lot of shit. Again, watch the series; they'd seen like a lot of shit, and even they are like, "What the hell is this? Like, what the hell is this?" So the SS soldiers who have been guarding the concentration camps had all left because the Allies are advancing and they don't have the manpower. And they're not going to try to protect concentration camps, waste lives doing that. So the Nazis said, all run off. So that this place is pretty much unprotected. So they just, they see these people who are like, literally starving to death inside. And so, them being kind, caring human beings, right? Think about what you would do. If you're like me, you were probably, raised in this environment where people would always tell you, this is like, ingrained in me, like, K through 12, especially like in elementary school. As people would always say, they wouldn't literally say, but it was like in the air, it was like in the water. Like I absorbed this through the pores when I was, especially in elementary school, this idea that it doesn't matter what you believe, it doesn't matter what you think. All that matters is that you're like nice to the other kids, right? That's all that matters. I was lucky, I grew up in a really diverse area. And so I, people from lots of different ethnic, racial backgrounds, religious backgrounds. I mean, my best friends were like, Roman Catholic or Jewish or atheist or whatever, and people from all different ethnicities, just, living down the street, like my, my friends. And so I think that's part of why they impressed us upon us in elementary school is that like, it doesn't matter what you believe. And what they, I think, meant was, it doesn't matter if you're an atheist or a Hindu or a Buddhist or a Protestant Christian or a Roman Catholic or whatever. All that matters is that you're nice to the other kids. And I don't know, I don't know about you, but it took me a long time to realize that that's actually not true. You shouldn't be nice to the other kids. You should kick them in the shins and steal their lunch money. That's what you should do. No, I'm actually really small, so that'd be a bad strategy. That's why you won't even be able to tell that because this is just videos. I can just pretend like I'm like huge. This is great. It took me long. That's not the part that's wrong. You should be nice to the other kids. The part that was wrong is that it doesn't matter what you believe, right? All that matters is that you're nice to the other kids. That's not true, right? So think about these GIs, right? They are liberating this concentration camp. They see these people who are literally, obviously, on the brink of starvation. They look like walking skeletons. They're so emaciated, and so they're being kind, caring, do as you would be done by kind of human beings. Like cut the locks off of these gates, and these people come out. And these GIs are carrying rations. They're carrying food, right? So what are they going to do? What would you do as a kind, caring human being? It doesn't matter what you believe. Just be nice to the other kids. What would you do? Well, of course, what they start to do is like to give all the food that they can find to these starving people. Turns out that's actually not the right thing to do. So, does it matter whether your beliefs are true? Does it matter whether your beliefs are orthodox? Yes, because if your beliefs are false, you can actually cause other people harm, even when you're trying to help them, even when you're trying to be kind. You can cause harm to other people if your beliefs are false. There is this thing, you can look it up. It's called refeeding syndrome. You can look it up. You can see it on the National Institute of Health website. Refeeding syndrome is when you give somebody too much food when they're on the brink of starvation. This is a real situation, a real medical condition. And this is not like, like me after I haven't eaten for 4 or 5 hours, like I'm starving. Not like that. Like when a person is actually, starving to death. If you give them too much food, it can send their body into shock and it can kill them. This is a real thing. And so they were liberating these concentration camp survivors, and they were trying to be kind, right? They were not trying to be mean. They were trying to be kind, and their kindness based on a false belief. They had this belief that these people are starving, and the way to help them is to give them a lot of food, right? That belief was false. And so their kindness, based on this belief that giving starving people lots of food, led them to do something that was actually harmful and could have killed these concentration camp survivors. Like, can you imagine that? You survive a concentration camp and you're liberated and then you eat too much and you die? Like, that sucks, right? So interestingly, this is what's depicted in Band of Brothers. Eventually a surgeon pulls up, like a doctor, like pulls up on a Jeep, and he's like, hey, you guys got to stop feeding these people. And they're like, of course, like, what the hell is the matter with you? Like, they're clearly starving to death. We're giving them food. And he's, I'm embellishing here, but he's basically like, yeah, I know you're trying to be helpful, but you don't know very much about medicine. I do. So stop, right? Like, we need to introduce them to food slowly. We need to get like IVs running, like that kind of thing. Again, consult your physician. I don't know the right way to introduce them to food. I assume that it probably does start with things like electrolytes and IVs, maybe even before you have them start eating solid food. Again, consult your physician. I'm not a doctor. But you do not want to just be like, here's like a ton of bread and meat and cheese and just, go nuts, because that can actually kill the patient. This is a very real medical condition that can potentially be fatal. So acting on false beliefs, even with good intentions, can cause harm to people. This is why philosophers tend to think, one of the main reasons why philosophers tend to think that relativism, this idea that, anything that you think is fine, is bullshit. Philosophers just don't think that's true. Because if you act on false beliefs, you can end up harming people, even when you're trying to help them. More contemporary examples. There's lots of examples of this. So that's an extreme example, and the reason I use it is because I hope it'll stick with you. But even just stupid, silly examples. I mean, if somebody stops you on the street and they're like new to town or whatever, and they like asking how to get to, I don't know, they're asking how to get to like Target. Target, the French clothing store. You've seen them around. It's got like the bullseye is the icon. Target. Target. Okay, it's called Target. Okay, I thought it was French. Anyway, they're asking how to get to Target. Come on. They're asking how to get to Target, and you're like, you believe that it's like west down Main Street or something, but it's actually east. If you tell them to go west down Main Street, like, you're definitely not helping. I don't know if you're harming them per se. You're wasting your time. You're certainly not helping them, right? So if you have false beliefs, even when you're trying to be helpful to people, you're not actually going to be helpful to them, right? So you need to make sure you have true beliefs. This is why Chesterton thinks it's important to be able to talk freely about stuff so you can figure out what's actually true. Because if your beliefs are false and you think that they're true, because everybody thinks that their beliefs are true, then you're actually going to harm people, even though you think you're going to help them. So this is true at all levels of reality, even just basic daily stuff like giving directions. Here's another just quick example. This is true. This ties into what I was saying in a previous lecture about how sciences are progressive. So here's something that scientists have gotten wrong and have recently corrected. I could just do this all day with COVID stuff. I know you're familiar with this. But here's another one. Peanut butter allergies. Some of you may or may not know that peanut butter allergies have been on the rise, and the peanut allergies, not just peanut butter, but peanut allergies, nut allergies have been on the rise in previous decades. Part of that is actually the fault of the medical community. Because they were trying to be helpful and they messed it up because they had false beliefs about stuff. So the prevailing wisdom in the medical community, up until like, I don't know, 5 or 10 years ago, it's changed. I don't know exactly when. They've realized that they were messing this up. The prevailing wisdom was, if you have a child, like a young child, an infant, a toddler, who has a predisposition to nut allergies, they believed that the correct course of action was to scrub that child's environment of nuts to make sure that they never encounter any kind of nuts. So many of you probably experienced this growing up, even that you went to kindergarten or whatever, and the school tells your parents like, you cannot bring any nuts into the school, like, period, full stop. Like, don't do it. Don't even think about doing it, because we have kids who have peanut allergies. So with kids who are predisposed, who have not yet developed peanut allergies, what they were doing is the medical community was advising that we sterilize the environment of peanut allergens, basically, of nut allergens, and insulating children from those kinds of things. So like if your parent had an allergy and they were worried that you as a child might develop the same allergy, they would just make sure that you never encountered nuts. That was a bad idea. If you're predisposed to nut allergies, again, predisposed is different than actually having a nut allergy. Once you have the nut allergy, things are completely different. But if you're just predisposed, actually what you need to do is you need to be exposed in appropriate ways. Consult your physician. Dear goodness, a disclaimer. Consult your physician about how to do this. If you have a child, do not just do this recklessly. Talk to a physician. But if you have a child that's predisposed to a nut allergy, what you actually need to do is expose that child to nuts. Because nuts are not dangerous. Except for Mr. Peanut. Have you seen that guy? He's got that big cane. He's dangerous. He beat me up once, so it was pretty rough. Aside from him, nuts are not actually dangerous. The problem is that your body overreacts to nuts. That your body thinks that nuts are dangerous, and so reacts too strongly to them. That's what an allergy is. It's essentially your body attacking itself, overreacting to something, especially something that's not even harmful, right? So nuts are not actually harmful, but if your body has not been exposed to nuts, then your body doesn't know that they're not harmful, and will treat it like it's dangerous, and will overreact to it, and it can kill kids. Like, nut allergies are extremely dangerous. So that's why it's really important to make sure that the way that we handle predispositions to nut allergies is extremely important. And so what scientists have realized in the medical community the last couple of years, whatever it is, 5, 10 years, I'm not sure, they've realized that what you need to do is you need to expose children to nuts in the right kind of way. So what they've started to do is if you have a child who's predisposed to nut allergy, they will give you like little puffs or whatever with like, peanut dust sprinkled on them. I mean, very small amounts, so that the body can be exposed to peanuts and it will understand, it will be able to learn that this is not actually dangerous. And so it won't then go on to develop a deadly peanut allergy. It's extremely important, right? So these members of the medical community, because they had this belief that the right way to treat children who have a predisposition to nut allergies was to sterilize their environments. That was actually false at the time. And so they helped cause a rise in deadly nut allergies amongst young children, which is awful, right? Again, I'm not saying we should blame them or something like that, and they were trying to do their best. That's part of my point, is that trying to do your best and just being sincere and kind isn't good enough, because if you have false beliefs, you can end up accidentally causing harm. That's why it's important for us to be able to talk to one another and to be able to challenge one another and to speak freely about these kinds of things, so that we can figure out what's true. It's a matter of justice, I believe, that we be able to figure out what is true so that we can actually help people and not accidentally harm them, right? So these are Chesterton's 3 points. First, everybody thinks that they're right. Secondly, everybody thinks they're orthodox. Secondly, just because you think you're orthodox doesn't mean that you are. And thirdly, it matters a whole hell of a lot if your beliefs are actually orthodox, right? So that's it. Thanks.